So in our next part, let's create a new type of enemy. So this will be a flying eyeball. Obviously, it'll have the ability to fly and ignore gravity. We'll have to do the standard stuff like putting it on the enemy layer, setting up a capsule collider so that it can be hit, and giving it a damageable component since it is a combatant in the game. It'll have a floating movement, so we'll make it so that it can move between waypoints when it is in its normal fly movement state. And on death, we'll make it so that it can fall to the ground to die and fade out from the game. So to create our new enemy, let's go into Art, Lewis Mello Monster Creatures Fantasy, Flying Eyeball. And I will grab the first frame out of Flight. Okay, so we can see that we haven't separated these sprite sheets yet, so we have to click on each one and go to Sprite Mode Multiple. So now we can open up the sprite editor, slice this by the cell count. So I think we're looking at about 8 cells here. Let's try 8. Okay, that's correct. Slice, making sure that the center point is in the center there. So these frames have been created nicely for that. And let's hit apply. Okay, now we can just drag flight 0 onto the scene. And then that will be the base for our character. So let's do rename of this, and I'll call this Flying Eye. I'll go into the characters enemies folder, and let's right click, create a new Flying Eye folder to hold all the animations and stuff. Double click into it, drag the game object into here, and we have our prefab with the sprite renderer. So let's jump into the prefab for the Flying Eye. I'm going to immediately change the layer to enemy. I'm going to add a component. Let's do Rigidbody 2D. I'm going to turn off freeze rotation, and I'm going to set the gravity scale to 0. I'll add a component for our capsule shape. So capsule collider 2D. And let's resize it using Edit Collider to fit our character better. So I'll drag on the sides first, and then pull the top down and the bottom up to give us a decent hitbox for the enemy. Make it a little bit bigger. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so we have those components. Let's add in a damageable. So this will have the health of our enemy. Maybe this kind of enemy, we want to set the max health to 50 and the health to 50. Let's just go with that. So I think if we hit play now, well, it's being affected by gravity, but I think we could fire an arrow at it and still deal damage. There's no animator on the game object yet, so I guess we need that. Add a component, animator, and that's going to mean we're going to need an animator runtime controller. So in the Flying Eye folder, let's create a animator controller. AC Flying Eye, click on the prefab, and drag in the runtime animator controller. Okay, let's hit play, and we're probably going to need to add some variables here. Let's fire an arrow at it. Okay, so hit for 0, and we see we don't have the hit or the lock velocity parameters. So let's add those in for the enemy. So trigger, hit, and then Boolean lock velocity. Okay, at a minimum. Let's hit play again. Test that. So I'm going to fire an arrow. And let's find the one in our game scene so we can see hit and lock velocity was set to true. Now, the Flying Eye is not supposed to fall due to gravity. So let's take the gravity scale and set that to 0. And the inspector, apply to Flying Eye. So we can hit play. We can fire an arrow at it. It's not going to move from that as well. So we should probably set up the animations for it now. So let's set up flight, death, take hit, create clip. And I'm going to make sure this goes in the characters folder, enemies, Flying Eye. So we want Flying Eye, flying, I think is what it was called, or flight. Well, whatever we want to call it is fine. Samples to 10, bring in all of the frames, and this will be a looping animation. We can hit play, and there's our Flying Eye loop animation. Let's create Flying Eye attack, grab 10 frames, and then we need to figure out which of these attack animations we actually want to use. I think that they are 3 totally separate animations here, so we can open up the sprites and take a look at them. So this is kind of interesting. It's like a spin attack. That's not the one I was using in the reference project, but that could be cool for something. This looks like kind of a wing attack of sorts, so we could use that one as well. But the one that I used in the project was just its simple bite attack. So the player walks into its attack zone, and then it just takes a chomp out of the player. So we'll just stick to the reference project. I don't want to go too far off the original. So let's take the attack, sprite mode, multiple, sprite editor, apply, and then let's slice up the sprite sheet. So let's go to grid by cell count. Looks like 8 columns. Slice, apply. And then let's bring all of those frames into the attack animation, just like this. And then we can test it. There's our attack. Okay, so now we need hit and death. So FlyingEye hit, 10 samples, take hit, and let's turn it into sprite mode multiple. Sprite editor, apply, and let's slice this with 4 columns. So it's a 4-frame animation. Apply, bring in the frames into the animator. So take hit 0 through take hit 4. Just drag them in, test by hitting play. There's our hit animation. And then we need FlyingEye death.anim. And let's get the sprite sheet. So same process, we put it in multiple. Sprite editor, apply, slice, count the number of frames. So 4 columns, apply. Go to animation, make sure the samples is 10. And then let's bring all of those in. So 4 death frames, and we can test our death animation. Okay, so if we look at the animator for our FlyingEye, you'll see that we have our 4 animations here, like so. If you think you might use multiple of the FlyingEye attacks in your character, you could just go ahead and create a substate machine in advance for it. If you think there's going to be some special behaviors that should happen in the attack substate, which has been the case for our other characters. So I guess I'll just do that. Let's click on the new state machine and rename it to the attack substate machine. I'll copy flying attack and paste it into here. We'll come back to that in a minute. For right now, I'm just going to delete the attack from the main state machine. So we have flying, death, and hit. So for hit and death, we can do it kind of like the other characters, where from any state we can transition into these, which means we're going to need to make transition from any state to hit and any state to death. So for any state to death, that's going to be when Boolean is alive is set to false, and let's make it true by default. Then we'll add to the conditions, is alive is false, and then make sure that on the transition you cannot transition into self, and turn off the transition duration. Now for going to hit, we use the trigger hit in order to do that. Transition duration 0. And can transition to self should be off. Yes, it should be off, definitely. And from hit, we want to go back to flying. So flying to hit at exit time 1, transition duration 0. No conditions for that. It's something that should happen automatically. And then to go between flying and attack, that's going to be dependent on whether our character has a target or not. So if I recall, we put the has target into the night script. So we're going to need something similar inside of our FlyingEye script. So yeah, that was part of the night specifically. Okay, so for our FlyingEye, let's create a empty game child. So this will be attack detection zone. And let's add a component detection zone. You can see how when we already write these components once, it kind of becomes pretty easy to just re-add them and reuse them. So the detection zone, I think we want enemy hitbox for that, since we're determining which targets we can attack. I can double check that later. But for this detection zone, let's hit W to go into move mode. Let's put it in front of the player. So we're offsetting the transform so that the local scale thing can flip again, like with every other character. Let's add a component and we'll do, let's say, a circle collider. Or actually, I think a capsule collider would be more flexible. So let's do a capsule collider 2D and I'll edit the collider. Let's give it a shape. So this shape is basically determining if the player is in this zone, we should switch to an attack state and try to bite the player. So then we're going to need another empty object down here, which is going to basically be the actual attack zone. So bite attack. And let's hit W, move this over here, kind of like so. I'll add a component. Let's just make it another capsule collider. So we probably want this to be smaller than the detection zone. So let's resize this a bit. And what would actually help us is if we were looking at the attack animation. So let's switch to FlyingEye attack in the animation window and get to that moment of the bite. Okay, that's good. So let's adjust where the bite can hit. Something around there makes sense. So let's look at the detection zone. And I guess we'll move this down and this down as well. So that seems like it should be pretty okay. And then let's look at the animations. I'm going to go to flying animation. So that's our bite attack hit zone. And this is our detection zone. I think those will work here. Okay, so for the bite attack, let's add in an attack. So this will look just like the sword or just like the knight's sword. It's just, it's in the zone. We deal damage to the player. Let's make this attack kind of deadly. I'll make it 20 damage. Why not? And we'll have no knockback for X or Y. It's a lighter enemy, so maybe it doesn't need to have a knockback. Oh, and let's also make it so that the bite attack can work when it is at that frame. So let's go to the animation attack. Let's find the frame right there. Add the property bite attack capsule collider enabled. So that's going to be enabled at this frame and then disabled everywhere else. So disabled. Here it's still disabled. After that frame, we want to disable it again, and then at the end it's disabled. So disabled until the attack is made, and then, okay, here's our hit frame, and then disabled again, and disabled. And yeah, that's basically the attack there. So now we need to use this attack detection zone to determine when we should switch to the attack state on our FlyingEye. So let's add a new component. Let's call it FlyingEye Script, create an add. Just gonna close all the tabs here for a moment. So we open up the FlyingEye. So the FlyingEye is going to need to reference the attack detection zone. So detection zone, bite detection zone. I think that should do good. Then let's go over to the knight, and I am literally just going to copy the has target bit for the property in the field over from here to FlyingEye. Okay, so it'll work exactly the same way. When it has a target in there, we'll be able to switch to the attack state in the animator. So we need to reference the animator. So let's get the animator as a private variable here, animator. We're also going to later need the Rigidbody because we're going to move the character, of course. So Rigidbody RB, and let's get those on awake. So void awake, and we do animator equals get component animator. Hopefully, since we've been through this a few times, it's just like second nature. Like you're building a character, you just know you're going to need the animator, you're going to need the Rigidbody because you know what each of the components do and why you need them. So Rigidbody, same thing. We need to get the component Rigidbody 2D. Okay, so we have those referenced in our script when it's active, and we have the hasTarget variable. So now we need to set hasTarget, and we're going to do that on update. So on update, we'll check if the bite detection zone has something inside of it, then we have a target. So hasTarget is going to be equal to the bite detection zone dot. Let's see, we can just use the count on the detected colliders, which, I mean, I guess that's fine for now. So bite detection zone dot detected colliders dot count is greater than 0, then we have a target. Cool, let's set that as the has target. If there is nothing, if it's 0 or for some reason less than 0 on the count, then it'll be set to false. Okay, now we can jump over here to the animator on the FlyingEye. We will add the Boolean has target. And then let's use that to move to the attack substate machine. So make a transition from flying to attack, state machine, attack. Well, actually, I don't know. When we have multiple attacks, we might want to go straight to the attack state FlyingEye directly, or we can use the state machine attack. So if you use the state machine reference here, it's going to kind of let the entry point of the state machine pick which attack it is, or you can directly transition into an exact state here. That's kind of up to you, actually. I'm thinking it might make slightly more sense to go straight to the flying attack here, since that is the specific attack we want to use. Let's also make a transition back to flying, and this should have basically no requirements here. It's just this is how we get back to our default state. Now for the flying to attack, add a condition, and that's going to be has target is false, or has target is true, sorry. Let's jump into attack, and we can see that's our entry point. So now we need an exit. Make a transition to exit, and that's going to be has exit time at 1, transition duration 0. And conditions don't really need one here. So with the knight, there was a point in time where I made it so that you would just loop the attack as long as the knight still has a target. But then we eventually changed it so that the knight has to return out of the attack state before it can make another attack. So maybe we want to do the same thing with the FlyingEye. Maybe it needs an attack cooldown of sorts. So for now, we'll just exit the attack animation when the exit time is 1, and that should happen every time. Okay, let's see roughly where we're at. I'm going to move the FlyingEye over here. Let's move the knight up onto this little hill. Just let him do his own thing for a little while. And then let's hit play and kind of test out the flying eye. So I'm able to push him. That's not what we're looking for. Let's jump into the knight and get hit. Okay, cool. So that's a obviously unfair knight. So for the flying eye, we want to take its colliders and make them all is trigger. So is trigger on the main one. On the detection zone, that's a trigger as well. So on the flying eye, that is not going to be a trigger because that's the actual collision shape for the character. Or at least I don't think I want it to be a trigger yet. Maybe later we'll make changes. We'll see. Attack detection zone. This is definitely a trigger. And then bite attack is a trigger as well. So we're dealing damage or detecting when something enters it, not using it as a physics object to push things around. So let's hit play. And I'll walk in here. Okay, so we can see we can walk straight through the flying eye enemy. That's actually what we want. And we have an error in the console. So let's double click here and see what's happening. Oh, we haven't set the bite detection zone for the flying eye. So on the prefab for flying eye, drag the attack detection zone into the bite detection zone slot. Okay, now let's hit play and see if we can have the enemy bite at us. Okay, yeah, it definitely is. So that's pretty good. It's not dealing damage to us though. So that's probably because the bite attack is not on the enemy hitbox layer. Let's change that to enemy hitbox. So I can hit the flying eye, obviously, that's good. But for some reason, the bite attack isn't hitting us. So let me see here. Bite attack, by default, that should be off, right? And then we go to the animation. Let's look at flying eye attack. The bite attack collider is not on. We get to here, it's enabled. And then that's where we should get hit. So let's hit play one more time and test it. Okay, yeah, I guess we just had to make sure it was off by default. And now we're taking massive damage. So one more hit and yeah, our player's toast. Okay, so that's already like half of the eye working. The only thing we need to do is give it movement. So how I want to set this flying eye up to move is that when it's not attacking, it's going between waypoints. So we'll need to set up a series of waypoints for the flying eye to move between. So back in the hierarchy of the main scene, I don't want these waypoints to be attached under the flying eye because their positions should be independent of where the flying eye is located. If you make something a child game object, then it moves with the flying eye. But we want these transforms of the waypoints to be locations in the game world which are static and don't change. So let's create a new game object in the scene. I'm going to rename this to be Waypoints. And then I am going to set its location to 0, 0, 0, just at the start of our scene. So I don't want this position to change the position of the children game objects. And then I'm going to right click on it and create a empty game object. And I'll call this iWaypoint. So this iWaypoint1, let's position it wherever we want the flying eye to fly to first. So let's actually say that's kind of like up here to the right. We'll move the knight back to the left platform. So let's take the knight enemy and I'll move him back over here. And now we're just kind of getting into like level design a little bit. But we have our first waypoint there. Now, it's kind of impossible to see the waypoint by default. So what you can actually do is give your waypoints an icon so you know where they're located, which is super helpful visually speaking. So click on your waypoint, which is just a transform, then click here to give it an icon. And I want to use like one of these little small ones to just give it a dot where it is on the screen. So pick whatever color you want and just select the waypoint color. So when we select it, we can zoom in really far and we can see it's quite small by default. So maybe we need to expand the size of the 3D icons. Yep, okay. So let's make it kind of like that. So I do want to see the waypoint icon, but I don't want to see the little player input on the player. So let's find where the player input icon is in this list and just turn it off. So down here, down here, down here, player input, click on the icon for it, and then that will hide it. Okay, great. So now we can see the waypoints, but we can also see our player normally. Okay, so now for the other waypoints, and we might want to take the exact position on them and make them more of a even number, so like 10.5 or something like that. Or you can even just make them even numbers if you want them to match the grid precisely. Or you can just make them whole numbers if you want to match the grid precisely, so like 11 and then 2 or something like that. When we want to add another waypoint, just select it and duplicate it, Control D. W and move it over here, set the value to 16 manually, and let's duplicate it again, and I'll move one up here to right around there. Let's duplicate it again, and actually you don't have to manually keep setting the value. You could actually snap to the grid if you want. So let's see, if we want to enable global snap. If we want to enable grid snapping, we can click here and change it to global. And now we can enable snapping over here. So let's do that. And yeah, okay, so our grid size normal. Let's see if that works. Yep, okay, so we're snapping to the grid precisely now. That's a lot easier. So we have waypoint 1, 2, 3, 4. You can rename them if you want. Waypoint, then just copy that. Go to the second one and paste in waypoint 2, waypoint 3, waypoint 4. There's also a setting in the project window where you can change how it auto increments. So if you want, you can go up to Edit Project Settings and Editor, and then scroll down here to the bottom, Game Object Naming. And so it's by default, it's like Prefab 1 in parentheses, but you can have it _1 or .1. Maybe I actually like underscore, so I'll just set that there. Kind of late, but good to know. So these will be the flight locations for our FlyingEye. Okay, so now let's take our FlyingEye a little over to its flight points. So I guess I could put him somewhere like there so that you can see that at the start, he's actually not going to be at the flight points. So we'll fly over to the first flight point in a list and then cycle through them and keep looping around. So to do that, we're going to need to edit the flying script. So first, let's give it a list of transforms. So list of transform, and this will be waypoints. Guess it can be, okay. And we're also going to need a public float flight speed. So arbitrary number, but I'll just default that to 3. So let's give it a arbitrary number. I'll make it 2F for now. And then as our FlyingEye is in the flight state, we're going to move towards these waypoints at the flight speed. So the direction is going to be determined by where the FlyingEye is and where the waypoint is. So then we take that direction and multiply it by the speed to get the final vector that it moves, kind of from frame to frame. So let's create a void fixed update. So we're going to need on fixed update, if the character is alive, and if it can move, then we're going to keep using a flight function in order to update its current velocity towards the waypoints. So let's generate that down there. We're going to need the properties is alive and can move. So I am actually just going to copy those once again over from night into here. So the is alive we can get from the damageable component. So let's make sure we have that as well. Damageable. And we'll get that on awake, get component damageable, and then we can check damageable.isAlive. Okay, that way we don't need to create another property inside of here, but we are going to use the can move. So just like on the night, we're just returning whatever value is set on the parameter. And then the state behaviors that are attached to the animator controller are going to set whether we can move or can't move. Just as a quick reminder to us to set that up later, let's add it to the parameters. So I'm going to add the Boolean can move here, and then that will be what we grab in the script. This will default to true, and then that will be what we reference inside of the script. So a couple more small things. If we can't move, then I want to take the velocity and set that to 0. So rb.velocity is just going to be equal to a vector 3.0. So if we're not flying, we're not moving. Okay, so in our flight function, we are going to be flying to the next waypoint. So what is the next waypoint? We'll need a couple fields up at the top in order to figure that out. So if we go up to the top, then let's start with a int waypoint number is 0. So this will be something that we increment as we reach each waypoint, and then we'll use that to pick the next actual waypoint out. And then to get the position of the waypoint, we need to store a reference to a transform. So let's do transform next waypoint. And we'll need to set this where the script starts. We'll default it to waypoint 1. So let's take next waypoint down here to on start. So we'll have to add that in, void start, and we'll do next waypoint equals waypoints at waypoint number. So we just get whatever's at index position 0 out of our waypoints list, and that's going to be our first waypoint. So the first location we fly to. So now that we have the waypoint picked out, we need to figure out the direction to the next waypoint. So vector2 direction to waypoint equals, in parentheses, next waypoint dot position minus transform dot position, and then we normalize that. So when you normalize a vector, it's just a direction without any kind of speed or value component behind that direction. So when you only want to have the direction, you normalize the vector. And then you bring in the magnitude or the speed component. Next, we're going to want to check the distance to the waypoint to see if we've already reached it, and if so, change to the next waypoint. So float distance is going to be equal to vector2.distance. And so here, our parameters is basically going to be the same. Direction to waypoint and transform.position. So this is like the magnitude between the 2 points, where the top bit is just the direction. And whenever we're moving towards a waypoint, we want to set the velocity based on our movement speed. So the RB velocity is the direction to waypoint times the flight speed. We don't need to put in the time, delta time. The Rigidbody already factors that in when it's moving. Okay, then we need to check if we're ready to switch move points. So if the distance is less than the destination reached distance, oh, I guess we could call that something better, is less than the waypoint reached distance, then that means that we are within range. And let's actually make that less than or equal to. So let's create that variable up at the top. I'm going to right click, go to definition. So I'm going to make this a public float. So let's cut this up towards the top, public float, and I think the distance for this is going to be very small. So something like 0.1f is probably good. So if we fall inside of here, we want to switch to the next waypoint. So that's going to mean waypoint number needs to increment by 1. And then we'll see if the waypoint number is greater or equal to the waypoints.count. If that's the case, then we're going to take the waypoint number and set it to 0. Waypoint number equals 0. So this is so that we can loop back to the original waypoint. If there is a count of 4 in the waypoints and our waypoint number is 4, then that means that we're already looking for a 5th waypoint because this index location starts at 0. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3. So if there's 4 items in the list, it means that the value 3 here is actually the 4th item. So if we're already at waypoint number 4 and the count is 4, then we need to loop back to the 0th spot because there is no 4 in the actual list. So then we need to update the waypoint transform. So that's going to mean next waypoint equals waypoints at waypoint number. And then that is basically our whole flight script. Okay, so let's take this and set up the waypoints inside of the inspector and go ahead and test our script. So we have our FlyingEye here. Each FlyingEye is going to need its own custom waypoints because each enemy is going to have its own path that it needs to follow for where it's going to fly in our game. So let's take the waypoints list here and add some waypoints to it. So I think what we can do is maybe select, so you can either click plus a bunch of times or you can set the number of waypoints over here on the right to 4. So this takes 4 transforms. So we just need to take each eye waypoint and drag them over into this list. Now don't apply it to the prefab because the prefab has no idea what's going on inside of this scene. If you open up the prefab only knows of the game objects that are beneath it. But remember, our waypoints are part of our level scene, not part of our enemy. So you have to set this up for each character in your game individually, of course. So let's go ahead and hit play and see if the flying thing actually flies between the waypoints. So it got to the first waypoint, but then it's not moving on to the next location. Let's see if the bite still works. Okay, so it still bites. So this is a problem with the waypoints themselves. So it came down here to waypoint 1. Okay, so here's the little problem. We don't want the normalized direction for the direction to the waypoint to figure out the distance. We want the next waypoint dot position here. We're getting the distance between 2 positions. So that should be all we need for that little fix. Let's go back out to the game mode, hit play, and let's watch the FlyingEye. Okay, he got to the first waypoint, now going to the second one, the third one up here, and the 4th one down here. And then he's going to take a bite at me if I jump in front of him. Or he should. That's pretty weird. Let's go to scene view and click on the guy and see why he's not biting me. Okay, he did bite me. I guess I just was not in the zone for that. So let's take a look at the bite attack. Or the attack detection zone is what we're looking for. Okay, so attack detection zone. Yep, okay, we do get the bite. So the bite is working. Maybe we need the detection zone to be a little bit bigger though. So I'm going to go in there, edit it, and let's just increase the size of the detection zone by a bit. Just because it tries to attack us doesn't mean it's going to hit us. So I don't think that's a problem. And then what we might want to consider is that when it is in the bite attack, or just in the attack state in general, that it's not going to move. So let's go into attack as the state machine, add a behavior to it, and let's set the bool can move to false on enter and true on exit. This is going to be update on state machine because this is a sub-state machine here. So let's hit play And let's jump into the enemy. And let's see if we can get him to stop when he makes his attack. Okay. So it's not doing that. Let's see. So the value in the inspector can move is still set to true. Maybe it is supposed to be update on state for that instead. Okay. So when we make it update on state enter, it does work. I think that the reason why this happens is that we're going directly into flying attack from FlyingEye flying. So if we change this to be going into the attack state rather than the attack, then it should work if we have update on state machine true. But because we're making a direct transition into the attack, we actually skip over this, enter the state machine. So if I change this to flying into attack state machine, let's delete this transition for a second here. I'm going to make the transition into attack state machine. We'll set the conditions to the same. Has target true, no has exit time, transition duration 0. And then we have the set bool behavior over here. And we jump over here and let's see when we get there, we enter the state machine. Okay, and then it does stop. So that's actually very interesting to me how when you enter a state machine, but you go directly into the state, it actually skips over the state machine enter behavior. So I guess that's something to watch out for there. If you want, you could definitely just set the bool behavior on the internal state instead. So you could put it over here, flying attack, set bool behavior, update on state, and do the same thing there. But yeah, definitely watch out for that one. The state machine can be skipped if you don't go into the state machine, but rather the internal states directly. Okay, so putting aside those technical curiosities, it does look like our enemy is doing what we want it to now. It can definitely bite the player for 20 points of damage. So as things are right now, the enemy always faces to the right. So having the enemy always face the right might be okay. We could also just flip the direction based on its flight movement speed. So that might be fine too. And it does look a little bit like the FlyingEye attacks us a little too soon. Like if we just kind of bait him like this, that's a little silly. So let's jump into the FlyingEye and I'll shrink the detection zone a little bit. Or actually what we can do is just move its position over here to the left. But snapping's still on. I'm going to Control Z that and turn off snapping so that I can get a fine grain adjustment to this. And let's take a look at the bite attack. All right. Attack detection zone over there. That's fine. So if we want to flip the FlyingEye based on its flight direction, then let's go into the FlyingEye script. And I'll create a little function here, update direction. Let's generate that method. So if the transform.localScale.x is greater than 0, then we're facing the right. Else we're facing the left. Let's make sure we get some brackets up there. So if we're facing the right, we only want to flip to face the left if our flight movement is actually to the left. So if rb.velocity.x is less than 0, we're going to flip, which means we take the transform local scale and make that equal to a new vector 3. It's going to be -1 times the current value of the local scale. So let's actually get that local scale up here at the top. So let's see, vector 3 current local scale. Oh, no. So let's get vector 3 local scale equals transform.local scale. So that's easier to type. So we want to flip the x scale. So that's going to be -1 times local scale.x. And then the other values are just local scale.y, local scale.z. And we can copy this same bit down here. The only difference is going to be that we use if the rb velocity.x is greater than 0, then we're going to flip. And we only want to update this when we are running the flight function. So if the movement for some reason gets overwritten by something else, we're not going to update the direction by default, only when we're running the flight function. Okay, I think that should do all right for right now. Let's hit play and watch our enemy. So he's flying to the right, and let's see, flying upwards, and then, okay, there, nice. We have our flip direction. And because we're flipping the local scale, our bite also flips the direction, which is kind of cool and exactly what we want. So the enemy bites and flies in the direction which it's actually facing and flying. So that's really handy and cool. A little bit off on the hit collider for that bite. So we're just going to need a few more adjustments again, moving the attack detection zone up a little bit. But of course, this is just tweaking things. Let's take a look at that bite collider. In the animation attack. Yeah, okay, that is too low. So let's move it upwards a bit. Maybe even all the way to here. And then just remember to disable it when you're done, because that needs to start off by default. Okay, and we can give it one final test, but that is pretty much it for our flying enemy. If you want to add another flying enemy, you just create a different set of waypoints, add them to the flying enemy just like we did before, and our enemy will be able to go around biting our player. And of course, it can still get hit and take damage. Let's take its death animation there. So the main functions of our enemy are basically working fine. It's flying, flipping direction when it needs to. The only problem is we still need to set up the death state a little bit. But as you can see, it is able to loop, so we need to turn that off. But also, we don't want the enemy to just kind of float there in midair. We want it to fall all the way to the ground. So let's hit play again, and let's see if we can shoot an arrow at it. Okay, got hit there. We don't have any aerial attacks yet. That's actually the next part. We'll be adding that in to make it easy to deal with these enemies. But yeah, let's hit them a couple times. This is a great spot to do it, because you can see there's no physics to make them fall to the ground here. So we need to set that up. First off, let's turn off the loop for the flying death. So let's go to the project, characters, enemies, FlyingEye death. Turn off the loop there. That's half our problem. So next we need to make the character drop to the ground when it is dead. So in the script, let's go to where we have it is alive and can move. So if it's not alive, it's dead. And if that's the case, we want to make it fall to the ground. So to do that, we can take the gravity scale and set that to a value. So in my testing, I like to put that as 2 to make it fall super fast to the ground. So let's go into the game view, hit play. And you know what? Let's actually just take the FlyingEye, and I'm going to set its health to 0 by default. So damageable health is going to be 0. So let's hit play here and deal damage to our enemy. So let's take the FlyingEye health, set it to 10, hit play. Let's jump up here, and we'll hit the FlyingEye. But we can actually see the pickups are healing the enemy. That's not great. So let's click on our health pickups, and we can see I actually forgot to set the layer. So those should be on the pickup layer. So health pickup is going to be pickup. Now let's hit play, and we shouldn't see the enemy pick up any health pickups anymore. So we just need to take a swing at the enemy, and you'll see it dies, it falls to the ground. Now it's stopping here because of the collision shape. Not really a problem, but let's see. If we go into scene mode and click on the enemy, let's see if we can show that collision shape. So you can see that the capsule collider, it is touching the ground. That may or may not be a visual problem for us. So for right now, let's actually just take the FlyingEye and let's add the fade remove behavior, 0.5 seconds. And let's go up there and hit him. Maybe since it's fading away, it doesn't really need to. Okay, so let's hit play one more time and take a swing at the enemy. So we can see that it just kind of falls and fades immediately. Maybe what we want to do with the fade behavior is attach a little bit of a delay to it. So in our fade remove behavior, I'm going to add in a extra delay. So if we hit play and we go take a swing at the flying enemy, you'll see that it fades as soon as we attack it. So what we can add to the fade remove behavior is a delay, an optional delay, so that it doesn't start fading immediately, or you can increase the fade time. So I'll try adding a delay. So in the fade remove behavior, let's add in 2 variables and say private float fade delay elapsed, and I'll set that to 0f. And then we'll have public float fade delay is equal to 0.0f by default. So in our update, we're going to have a if. So if fade delay is greater than fade delay elapsed, then we're going to increment that. So fade delay elapsed plus equals time.delta time. Else either we don't have a delay or it's already elapsed, so then we resume our normal fading functions. So this just means that whatever we set this to is going to be how long it starts for the normal fade to occur. So if we come back out here, let's set a fade delay to 0.25. I'm going to hit play. Let's go ahead and take a swing at him and see what happens. Okay, so you can see it was a little bit delayed there. Let's try with 0.05. So let's hit play, come up here and take a swing. Okay, so yeah, it's definitely delaying it now. One other thing is that when the enemy dies, it doesn't fall straight to the ground. It falls kind of to the right. So I want to take the RB velocity.x and set that to 0. So let's go to the flying eye. When we get here, I'm also going to take the rb.velocity and I'm going to set that to new vector 2 rb.velocity.x. And that's going to be 0 and rb.velocity.y. Okay, so let's test it one more time. I'll hit play. Let's jump over there, hit the enemy. Okay, now he falls straight to the ground and then fades away. So this is pretty much working as intended. So the only thing we might want to adjust is that making it so that when the flying eye hits the ground, it's actually above the ground and not kind of falling into it. So to do that, we need to set up another collider that only exists when the flying eye has already died. So let's take a look at the death animation and we'll look at this frame right here. So 0, 2, and we need there to be kind of like a collider that will go right across here and stop it from falling further at that point in time. So I'm going to jump into the prefab. Let's keep that death state up there so that we know what to work with. And I'll add a child game object. So I'll call this death collider, I suppose. And then in the inspector, let's add a box collider 2D. Yep, okay, that should be fine. You could probably get away with the edge collider too, but this is fine. So let's take this. I'll move it down here. For the position, I'll leave that set to 0, 0, and let's edit the collider and move that down here so that this box will sit on top of the ground. So I'm just going to kind of stretch that to the size of our character. And this is not a trigger collider. So let's actually take a look. In the animations, we want flying. All right, so we go into the death state. And I'm just kind of seeing if this collider makes sense as it is. Maybe it should be a little bit bigger to the right. Okay. So let's edit this and I'll just pull this out here. Let's be very generous with this shape of this collider for the death state. Okay, something like that's good. Like, as long as it covers the main body, I think that should be okay. Okay, so this collider is going to be disabled by default. So turn that off. And then in FlyingEye, let's go into the FlyingEye script. I'm going to edit the script. Let's add in a public collider 2D, and I'll call this the death collider again. And then when we get down here, we'll do death collider.enabled equals true. Now for all of this, this is being set on every fixed update frame. So a better place to put it would be to respond to an event from the damageable component that we haven't created yet and move it down below. So I'm going to cut this code, get rid of the else, and let's move it down here to the bottom. And this is going to be, let's see, a void on death. And then we'll paste that in down here. So on the damageable script, I'm going to create an event. So public UnityEvent. And I guess we don't really need to pass a parameter because this is going to be a localized event. So we already kind of know which character was dying. So let's say damageable, we can just go with death. So damageable death event. So on FlyingEye, we want to call the on death when the damageable death event happens on the damageable component. So if we go back to the start, we can add in a void on enable, and that's going to be damageable death plus equals on death. So we'll set up the on death function to call in the inspector. So now we just need the damageable death to be called inside of our script. So when we set is alive to false, I suppose that's when we can call the event. So if the value is false, then we can call damageable death.invoke. Okay, and now what this means is over in FlyingEye damageable, we have this death event. So we can add a new function to be called to it. So damageable death add, and we're doing this on the inspector. So we take FlyingEye, and then from the FlyingEye script, we do on death. It's probably still a private function. So let's go into flying and take that and make it public so that we can call it in the inspector. Okay, so now once again, drop down, and then we look for on death. So now we only need to call all of this once, which makes sense. We shouldn't need to update the velocity every single frame, or the gravity scale every frame, or the collider to be enabled every frame. So the last thing we need is to set that death collider. So death collider to right here. I might want to make sure this shows above the waypoints. So if you want to reorganize it in the script, you could just cut and paste it above the list of waypoints. Okay, and let's see if that resets the link between the collider and the collider. Okay, and since we didn't rename the variable, the box collider is still attached here, so that's good. Let's go back out. So I'm going to test everything. Let's hit play, and let's hit the enemy. Okay, where is that collider stopping? So let me take a look at the animation again. We have the death animation. We come down to here, the death collider, and we have the edit the transform. Maybe it's too big. Yeah, maybe what we actually need is for it to be above here. Yeah, that would make more sense. Okay, so now let's go in and hit the enemy. Okay, now the collider's working nicely. So it's just a position adjustment for the collider. We can test it one more time. Arrow. Okay, hits the ground nicely. So that actually makes the FlyingEye death a lot better now. And so that will pretty much wrap up what we need to set up for the FlyingEye character. Being able to fly around between waypoints, bite at the player, and fall to the ground on death, and actually have a collider where it lands right on top of the ground properly.